one of the founders of the Miquon School. And we're about to have a conversation about that time in Peggy's life when she founded Miquon. Peggy, I'm tempted to ask you the broad and general question. How did you find Miquon, and why did you find Miquon? And tell me about that. Tell us that story.
Well, this, I think, is a very amusing story, because Miquon really more or less started as a facetious kind of whim. I had been a friend of Peggy Box. We were the same age. We each had 3 children ranging from 6 down to 2, I think it was. And we were having tea one afternoon. Peggy lived in Bryn Mawr. And I had come to have tea with her. And I loved, I was starting things, and we began to talk about the school called Dartington Hall in England, which was the beginning of experimental education, started by Bertrand Russell.
May I ask you, how old were your children at that point?
Well,
were
from
they
6
in school?
down.
Yeah. The 6 was the oldest?
6, 4, and 3.
And how about Peggy's children?
With the same age.
Okay.
And
were
so
they in school at the time?
I don't think so. We were just beginning to get serious about education, and Peggy had met a man that had been one of Dartington Hall's on the board in England, and had been sent over to Oak Lane here near Jenkintown, a school, and was the head of that school. And I would have said that he was the one that put the idea and explained about this extraordinary experimental school where Freud sent his grandson to, and this was something that never had been done before in England, and there was nothing like that over here at that time. And so I was just thinking, I said, well, look, you've got all this money, I've got a lot of energy, why couldn't we do something like that? And we both laughed and said, sure, that would be fun, wouldn't it? And I said, you know, why I'm perfectly willing to do the work. I don't have any money, but look what you've got. We kept repeating that to her. And then she said, but I refuse to go to live in Chestnut Hill, because I was living in Chestnut Hill, and I said, I refuse to go to live in Bryn Mawr. So then we said, I guess that finishes the school idea. And then I said, would you bring a map? And so she brought out a map. We put it on the table, and I took a ruler, and I said, now let's see where the middle is. And I said, it's about here, which was actually on the other side of the Conshohocken, of the river. And I said, before we give up the idea, I'm going to drive there. And she said, all right. And then we didn't talk at all anything more about the school. And I said, I'll call you up, but I'm driving that way. So I went across the Conshohocken Bridge, and I noticed a dirt road going down by the river. And I got to the place where I thought it was about halfway, but probably on this other side, but I thought that didn't make any difference. And I saw this little road going up the hill. So I said, I guess this is about halfway, I'll just turn here. Then I came to the driveway of this place, and I saw this little old farmhouse, which was then just had a porch. And sitting on the porch were 2 men shooting crows, and there was no bathtub on the porch. And I drove up in, and these men said, what are you doing here? Why have you come in? I said, you've got a very nice place here, haven't you? And they said, I guess so. And I said, I looked around, I saw the stream, and I said, what a beautiful place. I said, would you rent it? And then they began to giggle and thought, ha, ha, ha. And after about 10 minutes, they said, yeah, we'll rent it. And I said, well, how much? And how big is it? Well, they said, what about $50 a month? I said, hold it, fine. I think I'm going to take it. So I said, is there a public telephone somewhere? And they said, if you go down here and turn to the left, you get to a station. And there's a public phone there. So I rushed there. This was 20 minutes after I left Peggy. I put the nickel in, called. I said, Peggy, I found the place. What about it? She said, take it. So then that's how the school started. It took exactly an hour and a half.
From both directions? Oh, it took an hour and a half to find a place.
Well,
where
and
you
to
would
think
have
it
the
up
school.
and the idea
Yeah.
and to do it. And,
When did she come
and
out?
then she said, Curtis will be home in a few minutes, we'll drive right over.
So she came out
She
that
came out,
very day?
as I remember, Peggy will have to check me on this, but either that morning or the next day, and we paid, and we walked over to the school and said, this is ideal. And this was just a stroke of luck.
Now, was that 1932? Was that the
Well, that
year
must have
or the
been
year
31, perhaps. But then we realized that we'd made a tremendous step, and that we called up Mr. Curry, who came over and it gave us a long talk of the new ways of what was happening to education. That it was time to enlarge it, to get more serious about the arts, and get out of the old-fashioned, stern kind of academic education. And it was very experimental. There was the Rudolf Steiner School had begun then, and there was a very good school in Boston called the Shady Hill. It was just beginning to open up these ideas, and it hadn't taken on except in certain small groups. So Peggy and I traveled around and visited. I actually went to Dartington Hall in England and spent 2 days there. It was founded by a very wealthy American who was a Tiffany actually, who married an Englishman and started and bought this enormous old place. And it was unbelievable how the freedom, complete freedom the children had. And I stayed there 2 days, and I went to the Steiner School in London, and we visited various schools within the vicinity here and became more and more interested, and we decided at that point that the place to look for a headmistress would be the Shady Hill School in Boston. So that's how the school began.
Did you have trouble attracting families to begin the school, to send their children?
This was the problem, was how were we going to get the pupils? How were we going to convince people that this was going to be a good school? Because we had the help of Bill Curry, which I think we couldn't have done it without him, and with Peggy working with him to set up what we really felt that was needed. And one of the things was we have it in the country, and that there could be a great deal of freedom of expression in the art world, but we'd have to pay plenty of attention to the other side too. And
well, now, did Bill Curry sell the school curricular-wise to the prospective
no,
parents?
So we decided that after visiting with him quite a while, that we could set the school up what we needed was to get a headmistress who more or less fell into those same ideas, and we didn't take us very long, 6 to 8 weeks, before we found this woman called Miss Caird, who was to come over to be our headmistress.
She came from the Shady Hill School?
I think she came from that part, but she had a very good dossier and rather good recommendations. So we got her. It was easier to get the teachers than it was to get the pupils. There were lots of people who were very interested in the idea and thought it was time for a change. And this was to be more, we wanted to be reflexive, flexible. And we weren't quite sure, but we would have to try it out. So then we sat down and said, now what about the pupils? And as we had 3, we had 6,
right.
of course, to start with. And the Bach family was tremendously well known at that point in Philadelphia. Peggy was connected with most of the leading things that were going on, the opera, the music, or the arts, or whatever. She had tremendous contacts. And I had lived all my life in Chestnut Hill, and had lots of brothers and sisters, and I knew a number of people. So we began to struggle to get people to sign up. And some of them would say, well, if you get enough pupils, but we're not going to send it, it's going to be 7 or 9. We have to have a nucleus of pupils. And then I remember a rather amusing story was that someone said, well, there's a woman named Beth Apple, her name was then, and she has 6 children. And I said, what ages? Oh, about 8 to 2 or something. Where does she live? So I said, she's our next. So I jumped in the cars in my same sort of spontaneous way and said, I'm going to go to her house. So I went to her house and rang the doorbell. She came to the door and I said, oh, you have 6 children, don't you? I'm Peggy Regler. And she said, well, yes, but so what? I said, well, you've got to send them to my school.
Did she invite you in to
And
talk
she
about it, or
finally
did
said-
she slam?
she said, this sounds great. And the next day she entered her 6 children. So that built it up quite well. And I think it was up until almost the very last day before school began, that we were still struggling, but I imagine that we got up to about 30. I am not quite sure of the numbers. But in the meantime, this was the spring when I'd come over here, we had to get a building, and Peggy Bachmuller, a very fine architect in New York, who'd been a friend of their families, who offered to come and spend the summer here, and made this building, which I think was a very fine building. And I think the Bachs put the money up for that building. Otherwise, we couldn't have had the school. We managed to turn the little farmhouse, we got the bathtub off the porch and fixed up the windows and cleaned it up. And there was still a good deal of room downstairs. There was really actually 3 floors almost. That it seemed to work out enough to start off. And that is how we got going. And then I think that I remember making a catalog, a little brochure that we had to take around. And I was thinking about it on the train today, why I remember that I put a quotation from Goethe, which said, with every liberation of the spirit, a corresponding control should be met, or the result is pernicious. But of course we were doing exactly the opposite. When there was a liberation, we would say, fine, we didn't try to control it. But this is what I had on the catalog, but it sounds so good, Goethe, you know.
Yes, right, yeah.
So that was how it went.
How was the school financed at the beginning?
Well, in the beginning, I think the teachers were more or less dedicated people who took a minimum. They were not here to make money. Most of them were Mrs. McFarlane, who was the great kindergarten teacher, was married, and they took it on as an extra job. They were more or less dedicated and were perfectly willing to work for a minimum salary. Wasn't a money-making thing for them. It was their dedication to education that made them come here.
But there was also rent to pay. And
well, the rent
provide.
wasn't very high,
Okay.
as you see. But there was a tremendous amount of reconstruction that was needed to put the place in order. How much, and if the school was going to grow, how we were going to handle that. And we started off, and I imagine that the first few years, you'll have to ask Peggy Bach if she probably subsidized it for a while.
How many teachers were here that first year? How many
Well,
groups?
I'm not quite so sure. I would say 5 or 6.
Oh, really?
Well, we had a dance teacher, we had an art teacher, we had Miss Caird, we had some assistants, and it was pretty heavily staffed with teachers, because you had to have a certain amount who could handle the different subjects that we were
That's
interested
right.
in.
Yeah.
And the fact that we had to plan the food, and the transportation was something new for everybody, either in Bryn Mawr, just they weren't used. Of course, Bryn Mawr was a little further because they had to go all the way up the Conshohocken Bridge and come down. And it never occurred to us at that time that people would come from Philadelphia on the train, which made a third group,
That's
added a
right.
third group to the school,
Right.
which was very helpful.
But that in the beginning they didn't come from
Not
Center City.
to begin with.
Yeah.
And then I think that was when Betty Fetter got into it from
She was
Philadelphia.
the Center City.
She was the one who began that. And there were several important people like Mrs. White and Mrs. Saunders who felt that there was a future to this,
Mhm.
that if it was properly handled. And I was not the person to handle it because I wasn't, that wasn't my potential in any way. It was just that the idea struck me as such a splendid, and here was all the material right here.